Welcome back to the new understanding about the perspective. I think we have to recall the previous things that we have discussed, and in extension to that, let us try to understand Indian society further in those perspective that we have discussed. So, I think keeping previous deliberations in mind, let us try to have the further deliberations, so that it will enhance your further understanding about the Indian society. So, I think when we try to speak about the Indian society, let us have these things in mind. Especially when we try to see Ambedkar's contribution, I think he had made many important statements. Like one statement that has to be recalled and regained from Ambedkar is freedom of mind is the real freedom, and he was more to be observed in terms of that the people have to overcome the resistance which is part of the mind in that sense as well. So, the freedom of the mind is to be seen as the ultimate freedom, and a person whose mind is not free, though he may be having full of chains, but he may be treated as a slave. So, one should see that the person whose mind is not free should be seen as a bondage in that sense as such. And he says that in order to overcome this, we have to have the freedom of mind, which of course is the real proof of one's existence in the life. Then we also try to see that he had also formulated in 1937 the Independent Labour Party, and this Independent Labour Party was again an important aspect of his life, which we try to see is going to be significant with regard to the presentation of the lower caste. Now, this Independent Labour Party, which was having its presence in 1937, was basically speaking about the contributions of what you can say the lower caste in terms of political unity. As a formation of a political party, he wanted to make that we have to have the political front for fighting against the tyranny on them. Then we also try to see that he has also made a very significant contribution with regard to the women, especially his contribution which has been visible through the formation of Mahar Agadi Front, which was basically a front led by the women in that sense, which is try to call it as a Mahila Agadi Front. Mahila Agadi Front, basically by the Mahar women in that sense as such. And the issue which he was raising up, of course, is that the women are also to be politically empowered, and that is how he is trying to make the upliftment and empowerment of the women. Apart from that, he had a strong fight for what I can say talking about the evils which are associated in and around the women's life. Especially he was trying to have certain amount of antagonism with regard to the tyranny which the Hinduism have on the women in general. Especially he was fighting against the Hindu Code Bill, and for that he had a strong resistance. Especially he wanted to work upon and transform the Hindu Code Bill, which he says is an important source of exploitation for the women in general. And in that way he tries to have certain uncovers of these issues. Then also it's not that he simply wanted to put the things, he wanted to have an ideological statement, he also wanted to make the things in action. And especially not only in the case of polity, he also wanted to have that there should be the contribution of the lower caste in the case of the nation building. Like he tried to work for the formation of the specific soldier team, which he tried to call it as the Mahar Regiment, and this Mahar Regiment was a representation of the contribution of the lower caste in the creation and in safeguarding the nation and the national interest. So that is how he is trying to put the people at the different fronts, economically, politically, and also in terms of the nation building. that is how he is trying to talk about the issue of upliftment. And his social philosophy, which is basically been said to have enshrined the three important issues. One of course happens to be the issue of liberty, that is one. Then you have the equality, and the third is the fraternity. So he was talking about these particular issues which are going to be relevant when he is trying to speak about the social philosophy of enrichment and enlightenment, that you have to have an element of liberty, the freedom in that sense as such, which has to be seen in terms of the freedom of mind, which we have discussed earlier. Equality, if we have to see, it has to be seen in terms of the brotherhood, in terms of the relationship which has to be there between the different categories of the people, and also the fraternity, which has to be with the similar other groups which of whom we are parts. So virtually we have to see that we have to have certain amount of amalgamation, certain amount of coming togetherness in that sense as such, which has to be seen on all the fronts, on the political fronts, on the economic fronts, and also on the social fronts. And that is how he is trying to believe upon that we can have the formation of the new India. And with regard to that freedom that we said, I think he has his own understanding about what the democracy is. He said that democracy is merely not a form of government, rather it is primarily a mode of associated living. So we try to speak about democracy in terms of not a political agenda, rather it has to be seen in terms of an associated living, that is living together, and also to have conjoint communicated act or experiences in that sense. That is another important aspect that we have to see. And ultimately the essence of the democracy, it lies in having the attitude of respect and reverence to the fellow men. So ultimately we try to see that democracy is not to be seen as having the political character, rather it has to be seen in terms of the change in the mindset, change in the common living, and also an attitude of respect for others, of the fellow workers with whom we are putting up. And he had as I said, that he has written and documented the Muknayak, that is one thing, and also Bahishkarit Bharat, that was another significant work which has been referred, which of course has been written and been edited by him in a historical phase. And we try to see that his constitutional arrangement, which he tries to frame about, it tries to represent the society in totality, especially when we try to see that democracy, which we try to see is part of the Indian society, it should not be seen as a top dressing, rather it should have the real essential character in terms of the undemocratic practices. So in order to have the constitutional framework of democracy in a real sense, it has to be documented and practiced in the real life. That of course should be the part and parcel of the understanding of the Indian society. And if you try to see that when he was talking about this issue of caste, especially one of his famous statement which he tries to speak about, is talking about the issue of annihilation of caste. Annihilation of caste and its enemies. Annihilation of caste and its enemies. That was an important slogan which has been raised by Ambedkar. And this annihilation of caste, he was basically being charged by Marxian understanding, that is the annihilation of the class enemies. So he tries to see it and imbibe, like he had Ambedkar, then Marx and Buddha, the combination of the three, the work which he has tried to make out in that sense as such, and he tries to speak about the annihilation of caste and its enemies in that particular work. And apart from that, he said that caste cannot be abolished by simple means. If we have to abolish caste, it has to be abolished not simply by having the inter-caste dinners coming together, rather it has to be abolished if we have the inter-caste marriages, because endogamy is the source of exploitation and differences between the various caste groups. So if we have to end the caste system, I think we have to not simply eat together, rather the intercaste marriages, if it is there, then it can result into a better outcome. So he was seeing that caste is basically seen as a state of the mind, and one has to really change this state of mind in order to improve upon the things. And he see caste basically as the disease of the mind, because it is so enforcing and also impressing upon, and also trying to make the people to act in that particular fashion. And for that he was putting that it is the Hindu religion which is responsible for having these evils which are been practiced in the name of caste. And finally, when he was trying to move out from Hinduism and adopt Buddhism, although he has a resistance, but he tries to give an alternative path, because it was not simply saying but also saying and doing, and which he tried to see in terms of a practitioner. And when he is trying to see that what we have to do and what I have done as a important leader, I have been able to do what, after passing through the crushing miseries and the endless struggles all my life has faced, basically fighting with the opponents, both the caste system, the contenders, the political leaders in that sense, the parties in that sense. And he said that I have brought this caravan when it has to be seen today, means a sort of a journey which he has tracked, and where he is trying to see that lots of hurdles what he had faced, ultimately he was in a position to overcome all these issues by his own effort. And this is how we have to see the transformation in the life. So this is the message which he wanted to give to the people, not as a leader, but he wanted to say that these things are to be seen in terms of the practices which the people have to adopt at the different period of time. And his final message which he wanted to give, and that was a sensible message, and that basically we try to see it in terms of an important trio, that is the educate, organize and agitate. So this was a trio mantra which he says is an important issue if we have to fight the battle of freedom. So in order to have the fight or battle for freedom, we have to have this particular issue of education, organization and agitation, which will be a supplementing issue when we try to see the transformation. And especially he wanted to speak about not only the caste system, he was also speaking about the Hinduism in a specific fashion. Like when he was trying to speak about the caste, he has gone through the understanding the caste, and one of his famous work that he has written and documented is the Genesis of Caste System. Now in this whole work he was talking about various aspects in which the caste system has emerged through history, and through these readings only he tries to build up the theory on the caste, and also how we can have the possibilities which can make us away from the caste system. Now that is one important work where he is speaking about this annihilation of the caste enemies in that sense as such. Then apart from that, his contribution also lies in the very fact that he tried to speak about the revolution and counter revolution. That was another significant contribution. He also has contributed towards the issue of economy in that sense as such. That of course is again an important aspect which has been reflected by Ambedkar. And with regard to the formation of the Indian society in terms of a important entity, he says that there are to have the different levels of reforms, and he talks about the reforms at the three levels. The first level in that sense of course is that you have to have the social, you have to have the economic, and then you have to have the political. So he was talking about the reforms that has to take place at the three fronts, the social, economic and the political. Social in terms of the fraternity, that is the sense of brotherhood of relationships between the different categories of people. In the economic, his major concern was to move away from the division of labor which was prescribed, and that division of labor has to be abolished rather anybody can adopt any source of occupation. So it should not be caste based occupation, rather of course occupation of choice, that is having based on certain skills which the person has, he can have his own way of generating and creating the occupations. And in the front of political, he was trying to see it in terms of the representation, that is the representation which is going to be meaningful in terms of the political aspect as such. That is the way in which he tries to see that all these things will lead to the transformation of the Hindu social order. So if you want to overcome the Hindu social order, if you want to go for the specific understanding about the changeover of the Hindu society, definitely we have to work on these three lines, then we can have a better understanding about the Indian society. And apart from that, another significant issue which one has to raise about Ambedkar, apart from his tyranny over the caste, he has also tried to work upon along with certain other categories of people, like as we said that he has tried to formulate a political party, he tried to put the women in the open front, basically in the public sphere. He also had tried to abolish the notion of untouchability, which he has tried to prove through the Mahar Tank Satyagraha. So these are the various aspects which Ambedkar has touched upon, and it basically tries to represent the Indian society in a new way. Now apart from Ambedkar, as I said, that another prominent name which we can say is relevant to the understanding of the Dalit perspective is Gail Umwet. And Gail Umwet, if you try to see, she was basically an American born Indian scholar, a sociologist and also a human rights activist. And Umwet has been involved in the Dalit and the anti-caste movement, especially the fight over the environmental issues, the farmers and the women's movement. So in that way, of course, Gail Umwet's contribution has to be very significant in terms of the revolutionary changes which she tried to bring about in the upliftment of the Dalit. And Umwet was basically trying to put his position as a part of what you can say, fighting against the Hindutva agenda. She was basically trying to have overpowered the discrimination which is associated with the caste system. So that was the significant areas on which Gail Umwet has focused upon. And it was basically she was part of this Dalit Activities Forum in 2001 at the World Conference of Fighting Against the Racism, and there she was talking about the issue of biologically inferior and socially dangerous categories of people, which is more dangerous even than the race. So Umwet's assertion was that there should be a cultural revolt in the colonial society, and the non-Brahman movement in the Western India, that was one significant contribution or the message which she wanted to make. Then she also had worked on reinventing the revolution, that is a new social movement in India. She has also worked upon gender and technology, the emerging Asian visions, then also Dalits and the democratic revolutions, and also the Dalit vision. I think Dalit vision appears to be a meaningful work which tries to narrate upon the Dalit perspective in a specific fashion. And this Dalit vision, which has been an outcome of the collection of certain writings which she tried to focus upon. If we try to just have a glance through the work which has been put by Gail Umwet in the Dalit vision, and if you go by the title itself, I think many things are there which are basically being talked about by Gail Umwet in a specific fashion. Like she was speaking about the two great traditions of India and also the construction of Hinduism. That is the two great traditions with regard to the Aryans, the Dravidians, and also how the Hinduism has started emerging in terms of a sort of a modification. Then it was also that apart from Hinduism, she was also talking about before Hinduism, that is the Buddhist vision, how the Buddhism has tried to work upon the understanding of the Hindu society, the Indian society. And another important thing which has been pointed in another work, in another chapter of course, is that before Hinduism, that is the devotional vision of bhakti, where of course she is trying to narrate the contribution of Kabir, Tukaram and many other people who try to work upon the evils, the social evils associated with the Hinduism through the various devotional bhakti activities, and that also has transformed the life of the lower caste. Then another work where she is trying to focus upon Jyotiba Phule, that is Hinduism and the Brahminical exploitation. That was another work. Then on the issue of patriarchy, because Hinduism also was been seen as a symbol of patriarchy, and in that it was basically the contribution of Ramabai and Tarabai, which has been significantly rated by Gelomvet. Then she was also speaking about the Dalit radicals of 1920s that was been there during the Aryan context, and also discussing about the contribution of Ambedkar in terms of the revolution and the counter revolution. So these are significant works which Gelomvet was trying to highlight, and at the end, if you try to see in the later phase or later phase of this book of Dalit vision, we try to find out that Periyar and the national question, that is the Hinduism as the Delhi rule, because we try to see that Hinduism was being regulated and controlled by the Delhi rule. So the question of the South, that is Periyar, how he was trying to work upon the sort of anti-Brahminical move in the South, has also been taken up by Gelomvet. And then talking about the contemporary issues of contemporary relevance, especially the Dalit Panthers, which were fighting against the feudal backwardness, and also the logic of Dalit politics which has emerged in the contemporary India, and especially she is trying to focus upon the rise of the Bahujan Samajwad Party. And this Bahujan Samajwad Party basically starting with the Kalshi Ram's contribution, how he tried to build up and how that can be seen as an important revolution in making the history in a new way. Now the important thing is that these aspects, if you try to see, I think all of them are depicting the understanding of the Indian society in one way or the other, but they are trying to see the Indian society in a very specific mode. That is, on the one hand you have the tyranny of the caste, in one you have the tyranny of Hinduism, on the other work we try to see there is a tyranny of the patriarchy, the patriarchal values which are associated with the caste system and Hinduism in that sense as such. Then on the other we also try to see that there is a cause for the centralization of the Delhi in terms of the rule. That is another important issue which has to be debated out. And then we try to see that how we have the formation of the regional and the local parties in the different parts of the country, especially we have the emergence of BSP, or we have the contribution as Dalit Panthers, which are seen as the revolutionary and the radical masses on the political lines. So I think if we try to see these contributions, then I think we have to really see that the Dalit vision which I have shared earlier in terms of a perspective, it has to be evolved in a very different lines, in a sense that then Dalit is not simply, the Dalit perspective should not be limited to the Hinduism alone or to the Brahminic hegemony, rather it has to be seen in many other fronts, and that has to be visible through many forces, and it has to be seen in terms of incorporations which tries to rework upon the understanding of the Indian society, their contribution, the contribution of the lower caste in the making of India. And in that way, if you try to see this connect, then somewhere we try to see that the Dalit perspective goes along with the subaltern perspective, in a sense that the subaltern perspective tries to rework on or rewrite on the Indian history, and also trying to have the voices of the voiceless. And here we have the Dalit perspective, which is also trying to have the representation of the assertion and also the transformation of the Indian society in a specific way. So we can say to some extent that Dalit perspective can be seen as part of the so-called subaltern school, the subaltern perspective, and in that way we can see that there is certain amount of association, the amount of commonality which is there between the Dalit and the subaltern perspective. But again we have to see that subaltern perspective does not encompass many things which have been talked about when we try to speak about the Dalit perspective in totality, especially the Dalit vision which has been talked about by Gale and many other works in that sense as such, where we do not find many shades of subaltern in terms of the writing of the history. So I think we have to see them differently in terms of its what I can say, the approach in terms of a specific strategy for working and fighting against the various issues in that sense as such. And the Dalit perspective basically has a meaning when it is to be seen in terms of having certain amount of revolutionary character, because subaltern sometimes can be seen more in terms of a discourse or a debate, but Dalit perspective sometimes has to be seen more in terms of radicalism in that sense as such, something which is going to bring about the transformation as has been discussed by Ambedkar and Gale in the different works. So we can see that these contributions which are been raised through this Dalit perspective can have a meaningful effect, especially when we try to uncover the Indian society in a new way. I think the caste system that we talk about, either it is Ambedkar's contribution in terms of the genesis of the caste system, but the thing is that do we really have such readings, prescribed readings, where we have the genesis or the understanding of the caste system from that viewpoint, and can we see that the genesis of the caste system by Ambedkar can be seen as a prominent literature in understanding the caste system? And if that is so, then I think we can have a new way for understanding the linkage between the two issues. And apart from that, another significant thing that one has to really point out is that when we try to have certain amount of learning, we also have to have many unlearning also. So the Dalit perspective is not the question of a new form of socialization or learning, rather it is also the process of unlearning and also trying to put the things in not only democratic way, sometimes it has to be presented in a more revolutionary and undemocratic way, and that is how we try to see the whole debate. I think the Dalit perspective in the contemporary India happens to be very lively, especially we try to see that the Dalit leaders for the contemporary Indian society, which tries to present the iconic figures of the Dalit in a very meaningful way. Either it is the statue of Ambedkar or an attack on Ambedkar statue that makes a meaningful act, and how the people are being charged and are being put together to fight for their cause, and that speaks about the sort of mobilization which have been there with regard to the people belonging to the category of Dalit. So we can see that the Dalit perspective is not simply a sort of a discourse, rather it has to be seen as a slogan for revolution to some extent. But the only precaution that we have to take, of course, is that it has to be done in a meaningful and amicable way. It should not undermine the presence of the others which are basically the empowered or the elitist, but it has to show their presence vice versa, in a sense that it should be a balancing picture, or it can have certain amount of hegemonization, no issue in that, but more important in that sense, of course, is but it should not be at the cost of the bloodsheds and the other issues. I think these are certain things which one has to be sensibly look into when we try to speak about the Dalit perspective. And since it is an academic debate where we are trying to project the Dalit perspective in a specific fashion, which tries to speak about the understanding of society in a specific framework, where the role of the lower caste, either it is the question of Jajmani system, or it is the question of the new occupations which are coming up as such, or it is the question of fighting against the untouchability, or it is the question of having the iconic figurization of the Dalits in the public sphere. I think these are the issues pertaining to the debates on the Dalit perspective, and it has to be reworked. We can have many other names apart from Ambedkar and Gilomwet, which can be part of that. Like in the contemporary years, we have a prominent contribution by Professor Gopal Guru, and Gopal Guru's contribution has to be seen in a very different framework, especially the correct mirror, of course trying to project the things in a very new way. Similarly, you have Kancha Alai's important contribution that why I'm not an Hindu, or we have many other contributions, revolutionary contributions which have been made by Kancha Alaya, which speaks about the versions of the Dalit in a specific way. Similarly, we also have Anant Telamde's contribution, which of course appears to be quite significant when we try to speak about the Dalit perspective. And we also try to see that this Dalit perspective has been charged and also democratically mobilized by using the various means, especially the use of the ICT. Now we find many important contributions which are there, which are going to be part and parcel of the Indian society. Like we have the counter currents, which of course is a prominent website where we try to see that Dalit perspectives are going to be an important issue. So we try to see that the contributions which are coming up, the sort of connections which are coming up to reinvent the Indian society are to be seen in such a fashion that it is not going to be something which is going to fight against our own people. Rather, it has to have a new way of looking to the society, sort of a self-respect, which Ambedkar has rightly said, that it's basically in a democratic way a self-respect for the presence of others and the change of the mindset. If we are doing that, I think we are trying to give due justice to the Dalit perspective, and this is how we have to really indulge and also imbibe and also focus upon and practice the Dalit perspective in the contemporary India. So with these words, I think we can have many more discussions, we can have many more names in the contemporary India which are coming up. Like we have Vivek Kumar's contribution significantly working on Ambedkar and also trying to have the understanding of Ambedkar beyond a limit in that sense. Especially he is trying to speak about the roaring revolutions, also trying to speak about the Dalit vision in a new way, trying to uncover different shades of Ambedkar. I think this is the way in which we can have the new learning. It's not simply the hegemony of certain specific concepts which are to be kept in mind while dealing with sociology. We have to have many new comments and concepts which can not only overpower but which can give the new meanings to the existing scenario of the Indian society. So with these words, I will say thanks, and definitely we will have some more learnings in the due course of time with more deliberations. Thank you.